Sometimes the hardest choices come when you're too young to understand why the world can be so cruel. In 1887, two children stood in the dusty street of Dry Creek, holding the reins of their beloved horse, knowing they had to sell the only friend they had left to save their dying mother. 12-year-old Josie tried to be brave for her little brother Tom, but her hands shook as she waited for someone to buy old Clover. Ellis Granger watched from his bank porch. He was a wealthy cattleman who had lost his own family years ago and built walls around his heart. But something about these children broke through those walls. When he saw Josie finally hand over the reins, tears streaming down her face, Ellis made a decision that would change everything. He bought the horse, gave the children the money, then did something nobody expected. But would this one act of kindness be enough to heal 3 broken hearts? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the McKenna homestead, where silence had become as familiar as the creaking floorboards and the persistent smell of willow bark tea. Martha McKenna lay still beneath her worn quilt, her breathing shallow and labored, while fever painted her cheeks with unnatural color. The small cabin that had once echoed with laughter now held its breath, waiting. Josie McKenna moved through the morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone far older than her 12 years. She stirred the thin porridge over the wood stove, her movements careful and deliberate. Every grain of oats mattered now, every penny counted. The cast-iron pot had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through generations of women who knew how to stretch nothing into something. Now it seemed to mock her with its emptiness. "Is Ma awake yet?" Tom's voice carried the hope that only an 8-year-old could maintain after weeks of disappointment. He sat at the rough-hewn table, his bare feet dangling above the floor, watching his sister with the trust that had kept him from understanding just how dire their situation had become. "She's resting," Josie replied, the same answer she'd given every morning for the past month. She ladled the porridge into their 2 bowls, giving Tom the larger portion without him noticing. "Eat up, we've got chores before we head to town." Through the single window, Clover grazed in the small paddock behind the house. The old grey mare had been their father's pride once, back when Robert McKenna was alive, and the future held promise instead of worry. Now she represented their last hope, and their greatest heartbreak rolled into one aging animal whose gentle brown eyes seemed to understand more than any horse should. Martha's wedding ring sat in a small tin box on the kitchen shelf, removed weeks ago when her fingers had grown too thin to keep it secure. Josie had found her mother crying over it one morning, holding the simple gold band like a talisman against all the things that were slipping away. The ring had been the first thing her father had saved money for after they'd married, working extra hours at the lumber mill to afford something proper for his bride. "Do you remember when Pa used to take us riding?" Tom asked, pushing his spoon around his bowl. "Clover was faster then." Josie smiled despite herself. "She was never fast, Tom. You were just smaller. Pa said she had the heart of a racehorse." Pa said a lot of things. The words came out sharper than she'd intended. She softened her voice, seeing Tom's face fall. "He loved that horse, loved us too." 2 years had passed since Robert McKenna's accident at the mill, but the children still measured time in before and after. Before, when their mother sang while she cooked and their father's laughter filled the evening air. Before, when winter meant extra blankets and hot cider instead of counting every stick of firewood. After, when everything became about survival. The doctor had been clear during his last visit. Martha needed medicine they couldn't afford, care they couldn't provide, and time they might not have. $50 might as well have been $500 for all the chance they had of raising it. But Clover, despite her age and the slight lameness in her left front leg, might fetch enough to keep their mother alive. Across town, in a house that could have swallowed the McKenna cabin whole, Ellis Granger sat in his study, surrounded by the accumulated wealth of a lifetime spent building walls. At 58, he had everything a man was supposed to want, and nothing that mattered. The grandfather clock in the corner marked time with the persistence of a heartbeat, each tick echoing through rooms that rarely heard human voices. His breakfast sat untouched on the mahogany desk, eggs growing cold, coffee bitter with neglect. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, had given up trying to coax him into the dining room months ago. Ellis preferred his solitude, though he'd stopped calling it preference and started recognizing it as penance. The carved wooden horse sat on the bookshelf, where it had gathered dust for 7 years, a reminder of hands that had once been small enough to hold it, eyes that had once lit up with wonder at its simple beauty. His son, James, had been 8 Tom's age when the fever took him. Sarah had followed 2 months later, unable to fight through her grief. Ellis had survived because dying would have been easier, and he'd never chosen the easy path. The bank would open soon, and Ellis would walk the 3 blocks from his house to his office, nodding to townspeople who respected his money more than they knew the man. He'd review loans, foreclose on properties when necessary, and maintain the reputation for fairness that kept Dry Creek's economy stable. It was important work, or so he told himself during the long hours when sleep wouldn't come. He'd built his fortune carefully, methodically, turning the small inheritance from his father into something substantial through careful investments and shrewd business sense. The cattle ranch outside town employed a dozen men and produced some of the finest beef in the territory. The bank served 3 counties and had never missed a payment to its investors. Ellis Granger was, by any measure, a successful man. Success, he'd learned, was a poor substitute for purpose. Dr. Morrison had mentioned the McKenna family during their last conversation, speaking in the careful way doctors used when discussing cases beyond hope. A widow struggling with consumption, 2 children facing the reality of becoming orphans, a situation as common as it was heartbreaking in a place where life hung by threads thinner than spider silk. Ellis had known Robert McKenna, though not well. A steady man who worked hard and paid his debts, killed by a falling beam that might have missed him by inches on a different day. Martha McKenna had taught Sunday school before her illness, a woman with a gentle way of explaining difficult scripture to children who squirmed in hard pews. Their children were polite when they came to town, the girl carrying herself with the dignity of someone forced to grow up too fast, the boy still young enough to believe adults could fix anything. The morning light shifted across Ellis's desk, illuminating ledgers filled with numbers that represented other people's dreams and failures. He'd foreclosed on properties, approved loans that saved businesses, and made decisions that affected entire families. But he'd done it all from a distance, keeping the human cost of commerce at arm's length. It was cleaner that way, safer. But safety, like success, had proven to be another poor substitute. Ellis rose from his desk and walked to the window that overlooked Main Street. Dry Creek was stirring to life shopkeepers opening their doors, mothers herding children toward the schoolhouse, men heading to jobs that would keep their families fed for another day. It was a scene he'd watched thousands of times, but today something felt different. Today he was watching for something specific, though he couldn't name what. The clock chimed 9, and Ellis knew it was time to begin another day of important work that felt increasingly meaningless. He straightened his tie, checked his pocket watch, and prepared to walk the familiar path to a building where he was respected, needed, and utterly alone. 3 blocks away, Josie McKenna was braiding her hair with fingers that trembled slightly despite her efforts at composure. Today would be the day they sold clover. Today, everything would change, one way or another. She looked in on her mother, who slept fitfully beneath the wedding ring quilt she'd never been able to finish, and whispered a prayer to a god who seemed to specialize in silence. Tom waited by the front door, his shoes cleaned and his shirt buttoned properly, ready to face whatever came next with the resilience of a child who still believed in happy endings. Josie envied him that faith, even as she fought to protect it. The morning was crisp with the promise of autumn, and somewhere in town, 3 lives were about to intersect in ways none of them could imagine. Ellis Granger would take his usual seat on the bank's front porch, watching the world with the detachment of a man who'd forgotten how to participate. The McKenna children would walk their beloved horse into town for the last time, carrying hope and heartbreak in equal measure. And in that moment, when their paths crossed, when desperation met opportunity and loneliness encountered love, something would shift in the careful order of things. Something that might just prove that broken hearts, like broken bones, sometimes heal stronger than they were before. The night had been the worst yet. Martha's fever had spiked just after midnight, leaving her delirious and calling for her husband in a voice raw with desperation. Josie had sat beside the bed, pressing cool cloths to her mother's burning forehead, while Tom slept fitfully in the corner, his small body curled around his father's old work shirt for comfort. By dawn, Martha's breathing had grown so shallow that Josie found herself holding her own breath, waiting for the next rise and fall of her mother's chest. The willow bark tea that had helped before now seemed as useless as wishes against the tide. When Dr. Morrison arrived at 7, summoned by Josie's frantic message sent through old Pete Hawkins, his face told the story before his words could. "She needs laudanum for the pain," Dr. Morrison said, his weathered hands gentle as he examined Martha. His black leather medical bag sat open on the kitchen table, revealing bottles of medicines that might as well have been made of gold for all the good they did families like the McKennas. And quinine. Without them, she won't last another week. Josie stood in the doorway, her hands gripping the frame so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "How much?" The words barely escaped her throat. $50 for enough medicine to see her through the crisis, maybe more if we need to continue treatment. Dr. Morrison's voice carried the weight of a man who'd delivered this news too many times before. "I'm sorry, child. I wish there was another way." $50. The number hit Josie like a physical blow. Their father had never earned that much in 3 months of steady work. Even if they sold everything they owned, the furniture, the dishes, her mother's few pieces of jewelry, they might raise $20 if they were lucky. Tom appeared beside her, rubbing sleep from his eyes, still too young to understand the gravity of conversations held in hushed tones. "Is Ma getting better?" "Doctor." Morrison knelt down to Tom's level, his kind eyes reflecting decades of experience with children facing impossible situations. "Your mama is very sick, son. She needs special medicine to get well. Can't you just give it to her?" Tom's question held the innocent logic of childhood, where doctors fixed people and problems had solutions. "I wish I could." Dr. Morrison stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement. He looked at Josie with the expression of a man who understood exactly what he was asking of a 12-year-old girl. "You have until Friday. After that, the fever will take her." Friday. 3 days to find $50 or watch their mother die. 3 days to perform a miracle with empty pockets and a determination that felt increasingly fragile against the weight of reality. After Dr. Morrison left, Josie sat at the kitchen table and stared at her hands. They were small hands, calloused from work, but still the hands of a child who should have been worried about lessons and games instead of life and death. Tom sat across from her, his 8-year-old mind working through the pieces of conversation he'd overheard. "We could sell my marbles," he offered, his voice serious. "And my slingshot. Pa made it for me, but Ma needs medicine more than I need toys." Josie's heart broke a little more at his willingness to sacrifice everything. "That's sweet, Tom, but we need more money than that." "How much more?" "More than we have, more than we can get." The words tasted bitter, like admitting defeat before the battle was truly lost. Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then his face brightened with sudden understanding. "What about Clover? She's worth something, isn't she?" The suggestion hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Clover, who had carried their father to work every day. Clover, who let Tom ride bareback through the meadow behind their house. Clover, who whinnied softly when either child approached, as if she understood their need for comfort in a world that had grown too large and frightening. "I don't know if she's worth $50, Josie said carefully, though her heart was already breaking at the thought. "But she might be worth enough to help Ma." Tom's eyes held a hope that made Josie want to lie, to protect him from one more loss in a life that had already taken too much. Instead, she nodded. She might be. They spent the morning preparing for town with the solemnity of people attending a funeral. Tom brushed Clover until her grey coat shone, whispering apologies into her mane for what they had to do. Josie braided the old mare's forelock with ribbons she'd saved from her mother's sewing box, trying to make her look as valuable as possible to potential buyers. Martha slept through their preparations, lost in fevered dreams that occasionally brought words of comfort or terror to her lips. Josie checked on her before they left, adjusting the quilt and leaving fresh water beside the bed, wondering if this might be the last time she saw her mother alive. The walk to town felt like a march to execution. Clover followed docilely behind them, her hooves raising small clouds of dust on the dirt road. She seemed to understand something significant was happening, her usual playful attempts to crop grass from the roadside absent today. "Maybe someone will buy her and let us visit," Tom said, his voice small and hopeful. "Maybe," Josie agreed, though she knew better. Horses were tools in Dry Creek, not pets. Whoever bought Clover would work her until she couldn't work anymore, then dispose of her when she became a burden. It was the way of things, practical and heartless and necessary for survival. Main Street buzzed with its usual mid-morning activity when they arrived. Shopkeepers swept their storefronts, women hurried between stores with baskets on their arms, and men gathered in small groups to discuss weather and crops and politics. Normal life continuing while theirs fell apart. They led Clover to the hitching post outside Murphy's General Store, where people often conducted informal business. Word would spread quickly that the McKenna children were selling their horse news like that traveled fast, in a town where everyone knew everyone else's troubles. Ellis Granger sat on the bank's front porch, as he did every morning, watching the town come alive. From his vantage point, he could see the entire length of Main Street, and he noticed the children immediately. Something about their posture, the careful way they moved, suggested this wasn't a casual visit to town. When he saw them position Clover near the general store and wait, hands folded and faces serious, understanding dawned. The McKenna children were selling their horse. The realization hit him with unexpected force, bringing memories of his own son's tears when they'd had to sell James's pony during a difficult winter years ago. People began to gather, drawn by curiosity and the possibility of a bargain. Farmers examined Clover's teeth and legs, discussing her age and lameness with the clinical detachment of men who measured animals by their utility. Josie answered their questions with dignity, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. "She's gentle with children," Josie explained to a potential buyer. "Never bites or kicks. She's carried us safely for years." The man, a farmer Ellis recognized but couldn't name, ran his hands along Clover's flanks. "She's old. That front leg's not sound. $20, and I'm being generous." $20. Less than half what they needed. Josie's face remained composed, but Ellis saw her shoulders sag slightly under the weight of disappointment. "I'll give you 25, another voice called out, "but that's my final offer." Still not enough. Ellis found himself leaning forward in his chair, invested in this transaction in ways he didn't fully understand. When he saw Josie nod reluctantly and begin to remove Clover's bridle with shaking hands, something inside him snapped. He stood up from his chair and walked across the street, his long stride carrying him quickly to the small crowd gathered around the children. "I'll give you $50 for the horse," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. The crowd turned to stare at him, surprise clear on their faces. Ellis Granger didn't buy horses on the street like some common trader. He had people who handled such transactions for him. Josie looked up at him with confusion and desperate hope warring in her eyes. $50? For Clover? That's right. Ellis pulled his wallet from his jacket and counted out the bills, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. $50 for the horse. He handed the money to Josie, whose fingers could barely hold the bills. Then, in front of half the town, Ellis Granger did something that would be talked about for years to come. He took Clover's reins and immediately handed them back to Tom. "Take your horse home," he said quietly. "Your mother needs you both." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Tom's sobs and Josie's whispered, "Thank you," repeated like a prayer. Ellis turned and walked back to his bank, leaving behind a street full of bewildered faces and two children who suddenly understood that miracles could come in the most unexpected forms. The medicine worked like a prayer answered. Within 2 days, Martha's fever broke, leaving her weak but lucid for the first time in weeks. She lay propped against pillows that Josie had fluffed with trembling hands, watching her daughter move around the cabin with purpose instead of desperate worry. "Tell me again about the man," Martha said, her voice still hoarse but stronger than it had been. "The one who bought Clover and gave her back." Josie sat on the edge of the bed, still hardly believing it herself. "Mr. Granger from the bank. He just walked up and paid $50, then handed Tom the reins and told us to take her home." "Ellis Granger?" Martha's eyebrows rose slightly. "I haven't spoken to that man in years, not since his wife and boy died." She was quiet for a moment, remembering. "He used to be different, before his losses." "Different how?" "Warmer. He and your father knew each other when they were young, before Ellis went away to make his fortune. Robert always said Ellis had a good heart, just buried under too much pride and pain." Tom burst through the front door, his face flushed with excitement and something clutched in his small hands. "Ma, you're sitting up!" He rushed to the bedside, stopping just short of jumping onto the bed in his enthusiasm. "Careful, sweetheart," Martha laughed, the sound like music after weeks of silence. "What do you have there?" Tom opened his hands to reveal a carved wooden horse, no bigger than his palm but exquisitely detailed. Every line of the mane, every muscle of the haunches had been lovingly shaped by skilled hands. "I was playing in the yard, and this fell out of my shirt somehow. I don't know where it came from." Josie took the carving and turned it over in her hands. The wood was warm and smooth from handling, darkened with age. Something about it tugged at her memory, though she couldn't place what. "It's beautiful work. Someone spent a lot of time on this." "Can I keep it?" Tom asked, his eyes bright with the simple joy of a child who'd found treasure. "I suppose if it's truly lost," Martha said, though her expression suggested she suspected the carving's origin. "But we should ask around town, see if anyone's missing it." The next morning, Josie wrapped fresh bread in a clean cloth and prepared for the walk to town. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with gratitude and questions. How did you thank someone for saving your mother's life? What words could possibly be adequate for such a gift? "I want to come too," Tom announced, still clutching his wooden horse. "You should stay with Ma." "I'm strong enough to mind myself for a few hours," Martha interrupted gently. "And I think Mr. Granger should meet both of you properly." The Granger house sat on the hill, overlooking town, a testament to success that somehow managed to look lonely despite its grandeur. Josie had never been this close to it before, and she found herself intimidated by the perfectly maintained grounds and imposing front door. Tom, however, was undaunted. He marched up to the door and knocked with the confidence of a child who'd never learned to be afraid of his betters. When the door opened, they were greeted by a small, elderly Chinese woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. "We're here to see Mr. Granger," Josie said, suddenly aware of how her dress had been mended and remended, how her shoes were scuffed beyond polishing. "We're the McKenna children." Mrs. Chen's face brightened with recognition. "Ah, yes. He said you might come. Please, come in." The interior of the house was as impressive as its exterior, filled with dark wood furniture and heavy drapes that seemed to absorb light rather than welcome it. Mrs. Chen led them through a hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced people to a study where Ellis Granger sat behind a massive desk, ledgers spread before him. He looked up as they entered, and Josie saw something flicker across his face, surprise perhaps, or something that might have been pleasure before it was quickly hidden. "Miss McKenna, Master Thomas." He stood, his formal tone at odds with his apparent discomfort. "How is your mother?" "Much better, sir, thanks to you." Josie held out the wrapped bread with hands that only trembled slightly. "We brought this. It's not much, but—" "You didn't need to do that." Ellis accepted the package, but seemed unsure what to do with it. "Mrs. Chen, would you see that this gets to the kitchen?" An awkward silence fell over the room. Ellis remained standing behind his desk as if it were a fortress, while the children shifted uncomfortably on the Persian rug. Tom, however, was distracted by the shelves that lined the walls, filled with books and curiosities from what must have been extensive travels. "Did you really go to all these places?" Tom asked, pointing to a collection of objects that clearly came from distant lands. "Some of them." Ellis's voice softened slightly when he addressed the boy. "That's from China, and that silver piece is from Mexico." Tom wandered closer to the shelves, his natural curiosity overcoming his awareness of social boundaries. As he moved, something caught Ellis's eye, the wooden horse clutched in the boy's hand. "Where did you get that?" The question came out sharper than Ellis had intended, causing both children to freeze. Tom looked down at his treasure, suddenly uncertain. "I found it. In my yard. Ma said we should ask around town to see if anyone's missing it." Ellis was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the carving. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I made that, years ago, for my son." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Josie saw pain flicker across Ellis's features before he turned away, walking to the window that overlooked his empty grounds. "James would have been about your age now," he continued, not looking at them. "He loved horses, real ones and toy ones, and the stories I used to tell about wild mustangs in the mountains." Tom looked between the carving and the man, his young mind working through the implications. "Did you want it back? I can give it back." Ellis turned from the window, and for a moment his carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing a grief so deep it made Josie's chest ache in sympathy. "No," he said finally. "I think James would have liked you to have it." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Ellis had lost a son. Tom had lost a father. Somehow, in the mysterious arithmetic of grief, their losses had led them to this moment of recognition. "Would you like to see the rest of the collection?" Ellis asked, and though the question was directed at both children, his eyes remained on Tom. "I have some other pieces you might find interesting." For the next hour, Ellis guided them through his study, sharing stories of his travels and the objects he'd collected. His stiff formality gradually thawed as Tom's enthusiasm drew him out, the boy's questions and wonder acting like sunlight on frozen ground. When they finally prepared to leave, Ellis walked them to the door, a courtesy he hadn't shown visitors in years. "Please give my regards to your mother," he said, "and tell her," he paused, seeming to wrestle with words, "tell her that helping your family was my privilege, not your burden." As they walked down the hill toward home, Tom chattering about all the wonderful things he'd seen, Josie glanced back at the big house. Ellis Granger stood in his doorway, watching them go, and for the first time since she'd known of his existence, he didn't look like a wealthy man who owned half the town. He looked like someone who remembered what it felt like to be lonely. Martha McKenna sat at her kitchen table for the first time in over a month, her fingers tracing the intricate pattern of her unfinished wedding ring quilt. The fabric squares lay spread before her like pieces of a puzzle she'd forgotten how to solve, each one representing dreams that had been interrupted by illness and hardship. "I started this the spring before your father died," she told Josie, who sat beside her mending Tom's torn shirt. "Thought I'd have it finished by our 10th anniversary. Funny how life changes your plans." The quilt pattern was traditional interlocking circles that symbolized eternal love and unity. Martha had chosen the colors carefully. Deep blue like the sky on their wedding day, cream like the wild roses that had grown outside their first home, and touches of green that reminded her of the meadow where Robert had proposed. Now the unfinished squares seemed to mock her with their incomplete promises. "You could finish it now," Josie suggested gently. "You're getting stronger every day." "Maybe." Martha picked up one of the squares, her fingers still weak but steady, "though I'm not sure I remember how all the pieces fit together anymore." A knock at the door interrupted their quiet conversation. Tom scrambled to answer it, expecting perhaps Mrs. Patterson from down the road or one of the other neighbors who'd been checking on them. Instead, he found Ellis Granger standing on their small porch, looking as out of place as a peacock in a chicken coop. "Mr. Granger," Tom's face lit up with genuine pleasure, "did you come to see Ma? She's much better now." Ellis held a bundle of wood planks under one arm and carried a toolbox in his free hand. "I noticed your front steps could use some repair," he said, his formal tone not quite hiding his uncertainty. "Thought I might fix them, if that's acceptable." Martha appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but under her own power. Ellis removed his hat immediately, his good manners ingrained, despite years of social isolation. "Mrs. McKenna, I'm glad to see you're recovering." "Thanks to your kindness, Mr. Granger." Martha's voice carried warmth that seemed to surprise Ellis. "But you've already done more than enough for our family." "The children mentioned you might object to further help," Ellis said, setting down his tools. "I told them this isn't charity, it's payment." "Payment for what?" Ellis looked uncomfortable, as if he hadn't fully thought through his explanation. "For their visits. They've been teaching me things I'd forgotten I needed to know." Over the following weeks, Ellis established a routine that surprised everyone, including himself. He would arrive mid-morning after his essential business at the bank was complete, carrying tools and materials for various repairs around the McKenna property. The front steps became level and solid. The loose shingles on the roof were secured. The wobbly fence posts were reinforced. But the real repairs, Martha noticed, were happening to Ellis himself. Tom had appointed himself Ellis's unofficial assistant, following the man around with eager questions and boundless curiosity. "Why do you use nails there but screws over here? What makes wood rot? Did your father teach you carpentry too?" Ellis answered each question with patience that seemed to surprise him. Years of loneliness had made him forget the simple pleasure of sharing knowledge, of watching understanding dawn in young eyes. Tom's enthusiasm was infectious, gradually thawing the frozen places in Ellis's heart. "Can you teach me to whittle?" Tom asked one afternoon, watching Ellis carve a replacement spindle for the porch railing. "I'd like to make something for Ma." Ellis paused in his work, studying the boy's earnest face. "It requires patience, and you might cut yourself while you're learning." "I don't mind. Pa always said anything worth doing was worth doing carefully." The simple wisdom in the boy's words hit Ellis unexpectedly. Robert McKenna had been a good father. Ellis could see that in the way his children carried themselves, in their instinctive kindness and resilience. He found himself wondering what kind of father he might have been if James had lived to grow up. "All right," Ellis said finally, "but we start with soft wood and dull knives until you learn proper technique." Josie remained more cautious around Ellis, though she was unfailingly polite. She helped her mother with the household tasks, kept watch over Tom's enthusiastic assistants, and observed Ellis with the protective instincts of someone who'd learned too young that adults could disappoint you in devastating ways. One evening, as Ellis prepared to leave after a day spent reinforcing the chicken coop, Josie approached him with determined steps. "Mr. Granger, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are you really doing all this?" Her directness reminded Ellis of her father, who'd never been one to dance around difficult subjects. "I know you said it was payment, but Tom and I both know that doesn't make sense." Ellis considered his answer carefully. The truth was complicated, tangled up with grief and guilt, and a loneliness so profound he'd stopped acknowledging it years ago. How could he explain to a 12-year-old girl that her family's crisis had somehow awakened parts of himself he'd thought were permanently buried? "Your brother reminds me of my son," he said finally, "and your courage reminds me of things I used to believe about the world before I forgot how to hope." Josie studied his face with the unsettling directness of childhood. "Tom likes you. So does Ma, though she's worried about accepting too much help. And what about you? I think you're sadder than you let on. And I think helping us helps you somehow, even if you don't want to admit it." The observation was so accurate, it took Ellis's breath away. "You're very perceptive for someone so young." "I had to grow up fast after Pa died. But Tom didn't, and I want to keep it that way as long as possible." Her voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what she was asking. "He's starting to think of you as family. If you're going to disappear from his life, it would be kinder to do it now, before he gets more attached." Ellis looked toward the house, where warm light spilled from the windows, and he could hear Martha humming as she worked on her quilt. For the first time in years, he'd found a place where he felt useful, needed, even welcome. The thought of walking away from that made his chest tight with an old familiar pain. "I have no intention of disappearing," he said quietly, "though I understand your caution." "Good." Josie's smile was small but genuine. "Because Tom's been practicing his whittling every night, and he's planning something special for your birthday." He asked Mrs. Chen when it was. Ellis felt something shift inside him at the image of Tom working carefully on a gift, his young hands learning the skills Ellis was teaching him. It had been so long since anyone had cared about his birthday that he'd stopped acknowledging it himself. "When is it?" Josie asked. "October 15th. "That's only 3 weeks away." Josie looked pleased, as if she were already planning something. "We'll have to make sure Ma's strong enough to cook a proper celebration dinner." As Ellis walked home that evening, he realized that for the first time in 7 years, he was actually looking forward to his birthday. The McKenna family was teaching him something he'd forgotten, that healing, like Martha's quilt, happened one careful piece at a time, connecting separate fragments into something whole and beautiful. October brought the kind of crisp mornings that made every breath visible and turned the leaves on the cottonwoods along Dry Creek into coins of gold. The McKenna family's small harvest was modest but significant enough potatoes and corn to see them through winter, enough preserved vegetables to trade for other necessities. For the first time since Robert's death, they faced the coming cold season without the gnawing fear of starvation. Ellis had arrived early that morning to help with the harvest, rolling up his sleeves like any common laborer despite owning half the businesses in town. Josie watched him work alongside Tom, both of them muddy to their knees as they dug potatoes from the dark earth. Her father's old work gloves hung loose on her small hands, but she wore them anyway, feeling connected to his memory through the worn leather. "Pa always said the best potatoes hide deepest," she told Ellis, as they worked a particularly stubborn hill. "He'd dig twice as far as anyone else thought necessary." "Your father was a thorough man," Ellis replied, straightening to ease his back. At 58, he felt every hour of manual labor, but the ache was satisfying in ways his banking work had never been. "I remember him taking extra time on projects at the mill, making sure everything was exactly right." "You knew Pa when he worked there?" Tom looked up from his digging, dirt streaking his face. Ellis paused, realizing he'd revealed more than he'd intended. "Some. We didn't move in the same circles, but Dry Creek isn't large enough for people not to know each other's business." It was a careful half-truth. Ellis remembered Robert McKenna better than he was willing to admit remembered him as a boy who'd shared his lunch with kids who had none, who'd helped Ellis's father repair fences without being asked, who'd grown into the kind of man Ellis had once hoped to become before wealth and tragedy had hardened his heart. Martha appeared in the kitchen doorway, moving with increasing strength but still careful not to overexert herself. "There's fresh coffee," she called, and Mrs. Patterson sent over some of her molasses cookies. They gathered around the kitchen table, the adults cradling warm cups, while Tom demolished cookies with the enthusiasm of youth. Ellis found himself studying the room with new eyes, noticing details that spoke of a family's love and loss. A sampler on the wall stitched with "Bless this home" in Martha's neat handwriting. Tom's arithmetic papers held to the wall with horseshoe nails, Josie's books stacked carefully on a shelf Robert had built, each volume precious and well-worn. "Mr. Granger," Tom said around a mouthful of cookie, "tell us about when you were little. Did you live in a big house then too?" "Tom, don't speak with your mouth full," Martha corrected gently. Ellis smiled at the boy's curiosity. "No, I grew up in a house not much bigger than this one. My father raised cattle like I do now, but on a much smaller scale." "What happened to make you rich?" Tom's question held no judgment, only the frank curiosity of childhood. Thomas McKenna. Martha's voice carried scandalized reproach. That's not a polite question. It's all right, Ellis said, though the question touched on painful territory. I left Dry Creek when I was 18, determined to make something of myself. Went to Denver, then San Francisco, learning the banking business. I was lucky with some investments, careful with my money, and ambitious enough to work harder than most people thought reasonable. But why did you come back? Josie asked, her question more perceptive than her brother's. If you were successful in the big cities, why return to a place like Dry Creek? Ellis was quiet for a long moment, his coffee growing cold in his hands. I came back to buy land for cattle ranching, but I stayed because this is home, even when I'd forgotten what that meant. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats outside. Through the window, they could see Sheriff Wade dismounting from his horse, his expression serious beneath his weathered hat. Martha's face immediately showed concern. Visits from the law rarely brought good news to families like theirs. Ellis rose to answer the door, his natural authority making him the obvious spokesperson for the group. Sheriff Wade touched his hat brim politely, but his eyes were grave. Ellis, Mrs. McKenna. Wade's greeting included them both, though his attention focused on Ellis. Might I have a word? Of course. Come in, Sheriff. Wade remained on the porch, his reluctance to enter suggesting this wasn't a social call. Actually, I was hoping to speak with you privately, Ellis, if you don't mind. Ellis felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him, aware that the family inside would be straining to hear every word. What's this about, Wade? Sheriff Wade was a fair man who'd known Ellis for years, but his expression carried the weight of unwelcome duty. There's been talk in town about you spending so much time out here with the McKenna family. What kind of talk? The kind that questions a wealthy bachelor's interest in a widow and her children. Wade's discomfort was evident, but he pressed on. Some folks are wondering about your intentions, Ellis, whether they're entirely proper. Ellis felt anger rise in his chest, hot and immediate. Are you suggesting I would harm these people? After everything they've been through? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what people are saying. Wade's voice remained steady, professional. Mrs. Henderson mentioned it to her husband, who mentioned it to the bank board. They're concerned about appearances. Appearances? Ellis's voice was flat, dangerous. You're an important man in this community, Ellis. Your reputation affects the bank, the businesses you're involved with. People need to trust their banker to be above reproach. And helping a family in need puts me below reproach? Not helping them, but the amount of time you're spending here, the gifts, the repairs. It looks like you're trying to buy something from a desperate woman. The accusation hit Ellis like a physical blow. The idea that his genuine care for this family could be twisted into something sordid made his stomach turn. But worse was the realization that his presence might actually be hurting them. Have these concerns been expressed to Mrs. McKenna? Ellis asked, his voice carefully controlled. Not directly, but word gets around. Small towns don't keep secrets long. Ellis looked back at the house, where he could see Tom's face pressed against the window, watching anxiously. Inside, Martha and Josie were probably wondering what terrible news had arrived with the sheriff. These people had already lost so much he couldn't bear the thought of causing them more pain. I understand your position, Wade, and I appreciate you coming to me directly instead of letting the gossip spread unchecked. What are you going to do? Ellis was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. He could fight the talk, use his influence to silence the gossip. But that would only fuel more speculation, create more problems for the McKenna family. Or he could step back, return to his isolated life, and let them continue their recovery without the burden of his complicated presence. I'll consider what's best for everyone involved, he said finally. Sheriff Wade nodded, relieved to have delivered his message without confrontation. I hope you know this isn't personal, Ellis. I think what you did for them was decent. But people see what they want to see, and they talk about what they don't understand. After Wade left, Ellis remained on the porch, staring out at the harvest they'd worked on together that morning. Inside the house, He could hear Martha's voice, asking Tom to help her with something, probably trying to distract the boy from whatever serious conversation had taken place outside. For the first time in months, Ellis felt the familiar weight of loneliness settling back onto his shoulders. He'd forgotten how heavy it was, how it made every breath feel like effort. The McKenna family had given him a glimpse of what life could be like, with purpose, with people who needed him, with children who looked forward to his arrival. But apparently, even that simple happiness was too much to ask from a world that seemed determined to measure every gesture by its potential for scandal. The worn leather Bible had belonged to 3 generations of McKennas, its pages soft from countless readings and its margins filled with pressed flowers marking births, deaths, and marriages. Martha held it gently in her lap as she sat beside the fireplace, the lamplight casting warm shadows across the familiar words. "Your father used to read to you from this every Sunday evening," she told the children, her finger tracing the pressed violet that marked the date of her wedding. He said the stories helped him understand how to be a good man in a complicated world. Tom leaned against his mother's chair, his wooden horse clutched in one hand, while Ellis sat across from them, his presence in their evening routine now as natural as breathing. The October nights had grown cold enough to justify a fire, and the crackling logs filled the silence between Martha's words. "Read us the one about the Good Samaritan," Tom requested, his voice drowsy with contentment. "That was always one of your father's favorites," Martha said, turning to the familiar passage. "He said it reminded him that kindness doesn't ask permission or worry about what people think." Ellis shifted uncomfortably in his chair, understanding that Martha's choice of reading was no accident. Since Sheriff Wade's visit 3 days ago, Ellis had been wrestling with doubts that grew stronger each time he looked at this family who'd come to mean everything to him. As Martha read about the traveler who stopped to help a stranger while others passed by, Ellis found himself studying her face in the firelight. She'd grown stronger over the past weeks, her cheeks regaining color and her movements becoming more confident. But there was something else there, to a piece that hadn't been present during those desperate early days when her children had been forced to sell their horse. "Pa always said that story was about you, Ma," Josie said quietly. "How you helped Mrs. Patterson when her husband was hurt, even though we barely had enough for ourselves. Your father had a way of making every Bible story about someone he knew." Martha laughed softly. "He saw the best in people, sometimes more than they saw in themselves." Ellis felt the weight of her words, wondering if Robert McKenna would have seen anything good in him. He'd spent so many years focused on accumulating wealth and protecting himself from further loss that he'd forgotten how to simply be present for other people. "Mr. Granger," Tom said suddenly, "Mrs. Chen told me your birthday is next week. Are you excited?" Ellis glanced at Martha, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I haven't celebrated my birthday in many years, Tom. It didn't seem important. But birthdays are always important." Tom's indignation was complete and innocent. "They're the day you were born, which means they're the day the world got better because you were in it." The simple logic hit Ellis with unexpected force. When had he stopped believing that his existence mattered to anyone? When had birthdays become just another reminder of time passing without meaning? "Tom's right," Martha said gently. "Everyone deserves to have their birth celebrated, especially someone who's given us so much." "I haven't given you anything you didn't already possess," Ellis replied. "Your strength, your love for each other, those things were always there. I just provided some temporary assistance." Martha closed the Bible and looked at him directly, her gaze steady and knowing. "Ellis, may I ask you something personal?" He nodded, though her tone suggested he might not like the question. "When you bought Clover and gave her back to us, what were you thinking in that moment? Not what you tell yourself now, but what you actually felt then." Ellis was quiet for a long time, remembering that day when he'd watched Josie's composure crumble as she handed over her horse's reins. The desperation in her eyes had called to something deep inside him, something he'd thought was permanently buried. "I was thinking about my son," he said finally, "about how he cried when we had to sell his pony during a difficult winter, about how I promised him we'd get another horse someday, but then he died before I could keep that promise. And when you gave Clover back, I was giving my son the ending I couldn't give him. I was keeping a promise 7 years too late. Martha nodded as if his answer confirmed something she'd already suspected. Your father and I used to worry about you when you were young. You had such a tender heart, but you tried to hide it behind ambition and pride. Robert always said you'd find your way back to yourself eventually. You knew my father? Everyone knew Thomas Granger. He was a good man who raised his son with love and principles, even if that son spent years pretending he'd forgotten them. Martha's smile was gentle but direct. Robert used to say you reminded him of a tree that grows crooked trying to reach the light, but the roots are still strong. Ellis felt something crack open inside his chest, a pain that was both old grief and new hope struggling to coexist. I'm not sure I'm the man my father hoped I'd become. Maybe not yet, but you're becoming him. Tom had fallen asleep against his mother's chair, his wooden horse dropping from his relaxed fingers. Ellis bent to pick it up, his hands gentle as he placed it safely on the side table. He's been working on something for your birthday, Josie said quietly, practicing his whittling every night after you leave. It's supposed to be a surprise. I shouldn't accept gifts from you. People are already talking. Let them talk. Martha's interruption was firm, carrying a strength that reminded Ellis why Robert McKenna had been wise enough to marry her. This family doesn't make decisions based on other people's gossip. We make them based on what's right. But if my presence is causing you problems, your presence is a blessing. Martha stood and moved to the window, looking out at the October night. Do you know what I see when I look at my children now? I see Tom laughing again. I see Josie acting like a 12-year-old instead of carrying the weight of the world. I see a family that's healing because someone cared enough to help us when we needed it most. She turned back to face him, her expression resolute. I don't care what people say about appearances or propriety. I care about kindness and love, and the kind of man who buys a horse just to give it back to heartbroken children. Ellis felt tears threaten for the first time in years. I don't deserve your faith in me. Deserve has nothing to do with it. Faith isn't something you earn, it's something you receive and try to live up to. Martha's voice carried the certainty of someone who'd learned these truths through suffering. My husband saw goodness in you 20 years ago, and I see it now. The only question is whether you're brave enough to see it in yourself. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them all that winter was coming. But inside the small cabin, warmed by fire and filled with the quiet contentment of people who'd found each other, the cold seemed very far away. Ellis looked around the room at Tom, sleeping peacefully, at Josie working on her lessons by lamplight, at Martha, whose faith in him felt like an undeserved gift, and made a decision that had been building in his heart for weeks. Whatever the town thought, whatever problems his presence might cause, he wasn't going to abandon this family. They'd taught him something more valuable than all his accumulated wealth, that love, once found, was worth fighting for. Ellis's study had become a more welcoming place over the past months, warmed by regular visits from the McKenna children and softened by their laughter, echoing off walls that had grown accustomed to silence. On this particular morning, while Ellis worked at his desk and Tom practiced his whittling in the corner, Josie had asked if she might organize some of the books that had been stacked haphazardly on the lower shelves. Some of these look like they haven't been touched in years, she observed, carefully dusting each volume before finding it a proper place. You're probably right, Ellis replied without looking up from his ledgers. Mrs. Chen isn't allowed in here very often. I prefer to maintain my own order, though I'll admit it's not always apparent to others. Josie worked methodically, her natural inclination toward organization evident in the way she grouped similar books together and arranged them by height. She was reaching for a volume that had fallen behind the others when her fingers encountered something unexpected, a small, flat object wedged between the bookshelf and the wall. It was a photograph, the kind taken by traveling photographers who visited small towns with their large cameras and chemical baths. But as Josie pulled it free and examined it in the light, her breath caught in her throat. The tintype showed 2 boys, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, standing beside a fence with their arms around each other's shoulders. One boy was clearly Elish's distinctive features, recognizable, even softened by youth. But the other boy, the smaller one with the wide grin and mischievous eyes, looked remarkably familiar. "Mr. Granger," Josie said, her voice strange enough to make both Ellis and Tom look up from their work. "I found this behind your books." She held out the photograph with hands that trembled slightly. Ellis rose from his desk and took it, his face going pale as recognition dawned. "Where did you find this?" "It was wedged behind the shelf. I think it fell and got trapped." Josie watched his expression carefully. "Mr. Granger, who is that other boy? He looks like Tom." Ellis's voice was barely above a whisper. He sank into his chair, the photograph trembling in his hands. "He looks exactly like Tom." Tom abandoned his whittling and crossed to peer at the image. "Is that you, Mr. Granger? You were little once too?" "Yes, I was little once." Ellis's eyes remained fixed on the photograph, his expression cycling through emotions too complex for the children to read. "And that other boy, that's your father." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of confusion and dawning understanding. Josie felt the world shift around her, as if everything she thought she knew had suddenly rearranged itself into an entirely different pattern. "Ah, Pa." Tom's voice was small, uncertain. "But how did you know our Pa when you were little?" Ellis was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a confession he'd never intended to make. "Robert McKenna was my best friend when we were boys. We grew up on neighboring properties, went to school together, got into trouble together. He was the closest thing to a brother I ever had." "But you said you barely knew him," Josie said, her young mind struggling to process this revelation. "When we were working in the garden, you said you didn't move in the same circles." I lied. The admission came out flat, matter of fact. Not maliciously, but I lied nonetheless. "I knew your father very well. I loved him like family." Tom moved closer to Ellis, his child's intuition sensing pain, even if he couldn't understand its source. "Then why didn't you visit us before Ma got sick? Why didn't you help us when Pa died?" The question cut deeper than any reproach Ellis had ever received. He looked at these children, Robert's children, and saw his friend's features reflected in their faces, his friend's kindness evident in their willingness to trust despite their losses. "Because I was ashamed," Ellis said finally. "Because when I left Dry Creek to make my fortune, I told myself I was better than the people I'd grown up with. I convinced myself that my friendship with your father was just childhood sentiment, something I needed to outgrow." "But you came back," Josie said, her voice carrying both hurt and confusion. "You built your house here, started your business. Didn't you want to see him again?" Ellis stood and walked to the window, unable to meet their eyes. "When I returned to Dry Creek, your father came to see me. He brought your mother, introduced me to you children when you were babies. He was so proud of his family, so happy with the life he'd built." "What happened?" Josie asked, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer wouldn't be pleasant. "I was polite but distant. I treated him like a casual acquaintance instead of my oldest friend. I was so concerned with maintaining my new position in society, so worried about what people would think if they saw the wealthy banker socializing with a mill worker." Ellis's voice broke slightly. "Robert tried several times to renew our friendship. He invited me to dinner, asked if I'd like to go fishing like we used to as boys. I made excuses every time." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Tom, too young to fully grasp the complexity of adult pride and social expectations, looked between Ellis and the photograph with growing distress. "So when Pa died," Tom said slowly, "you already knew us. You knew we needed help." "I knew." Ellis turned back to face them, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I heard about the accident at the mill. I attended the funeral, standing at the back where your mother couldn't see me. I knew you were struggling, knew you needed help, and I did nothing." "Why?" Josie's question was direct, demanding. "Because I was a coward. Because I was afraid that helping you would mean admitting I'd been wrong about what mattered. Because I'd spent so many years building walls around myself that I'd forgotten how to tear them down." Ellis picked up the photograph again, his thumb brushing across his friend's young face. "When I saw you in town that day, trying to sell clover, I saw Robert in both of you. I saw the friend I'd failed, the man I should have helped long before his children were forced to sacrifice everything they loved. So helping us was really about Pa?" Tom's voice was small, hurt. "Not about us?" Ellis knelt down to Tom's level, his expression urgent. "No, son. It started as guilt over your father, but it became about love for you and your sister and your mother. You've taught me things I thought I'd forgotten: how to laugh, how to hope, how to care about something more important than money or reputation." Josie stood rigidly by the bookshelf, her young face working through emotions too complex for her years. "All this time, you've been feeling guilty. That's why you helped us. That's why you've been so kind." "Guilt brought me to you," Ellis admitted, "but love has kept me here." "Does Ma know?" Josie asked. "Does she know you were Pa's friend?" Ellis shook his head. "I don't think so. She was very young when Robert and I were boys, and by the time they married, I'd already distanced myself from my past." Tom looked at the photograph again, studying the two boys who'd been friends before life, complicated everything with pride and social expectations and the weight of choices made and unmade. "I think Pa would want us to be friends now," he said finally, his 8-year-old wisdom cutting through all the adult complications with startling clarity. "I think he'd be happy that you're taking care of us." Ellis felt something break open in his chestnut, painful, but liberating, like a dam giving way to let a river flow freely again. "I hope so, Tom. I hope he'd forgive me for taking so long to remember what really matters." Josie remained quiet, but Ellis could see her processing this new information, fitting it into her understanding of their relationship and what it meant for their future. The truth changed everything, and nothing Ellis was still the man who'd saved their mother's life, still the person who'd become essential to their daily happiness. But now they understood the deeper currents that had brought him to them, the guilt and love and loss that had finally broken through his carefully constructed isolation. "We should tell Ma," Josie said finally. "She deserves to know the truth." Ellis nodded, knowing she was right, even as the prospect terrified him. Martha's opinion mattered more than he'd realized, and he wasn't sure how she'd react to learning that his help had been motivated initially by guilt rather than pure kindness. But as he looked at Robert's children, his friend's legacy made flesh, Ellis realized that the truth, however complicated, was always better than the alternatives. The photograph in his hands seemed to pulse with memories of simpler times, when friendship was uncomplicated and love didn't require justification. Now he just had to hope that Martha McKenna would understand that sometimes people needed to lose their way completely before they could find their way home. The legal document lay spread across Ellis's mahogany desk like a map to a future he might never see. His last will and testament, carefully revised over the past 3 sleepless nights, represented the most important decision of his life and potentially the most painful gift he'd ever tried to give. Mrs. Chen brought him coffee he didn't drink and meals he barely touched, her worried glances speaking volumes about his haggard appearance. Ellis had aged years in the week, since the photograph's discovery, since Martha had learned the truth about his friendship with her husband and the guilt that had initially motivated his help. The conversation with Martha had been unlike anything Ellis had ever experienced. She'd listened to his confession with the same calm attention she gave to her children's problems, asking occasional questions, but offering no immediate judgment. When he'd finished explaining everything, his pride, his cowardice, his years of willful blindness to their struggle, she'd been quiet for so long that Ellis had begun to fear he'd lost her respect forever. Finally, she'd spoken. "Robert used to say that you were the smartest boy in Dry Creek, but sometimes too smart for your own good. He never stopped hoping you'd find your way back to the person you used to be. And now that you know the truth, that I let you suffer for 2 years because I was too proud to admit my mistakes?" Martha had looked at him with eyes that held no condemnation, only a sadness that seemed to encompass all the complicated ways people failed each other. "I know that you're here now. I know that my children are alive and happy because you finally remembered how to be the friend Robert always believed you could be." But even Martha's forgiveness couldn't protect them from the storm that was gathering in town. The bank board had called an emergency meeting for Friday morning. Ellis had received the formal notice 3 days ago, delivered by a nervous clerk who couldn't meet his eyes. The message was brief but unmistakable. His relationship with the McKenna family had become a liability that the board could no longer ignore. The community's confidence in the bank depends on its president maintaining the highest standards of propriety. The notice read, "Recent concerns about your personal conduct require immediate board review and potential corrective action." Ellis understood the euphemistic language perfectly. They wanted him to choose between his position and his newfound family, between financial security and the people who'd taught him how to live again. The choice should have been obvious. The bank presidency provided him with purpose, respect, and the means to continue helping not just the McKennas, but other families in need. Walking away would mean losing his influence, his ability to make a difference in the community he'd spent decades serving. But as Ellis worked late into the night, finalizing the legal arrangements that would secure the McKenna family's future regardless of what happened to him, he realized that his priorities had shifted in ways he was still discovering. The will was comprehensive, leaving the majority of his estate to Martha, Josie, and Tom. The ranch would provide them with steady income from cattle sales and leasing grazing rights. The house in town could be sold or rented as they saw fit. His bank shares would ensure they never again faced the kind of desperate poverty that had forced children to sell their beloved horse. But beyond the financial provisions, Ellis had included something more personal, a letter to be read aloud, explaining his actions and asking their forgiveness for any pain his choices might cause them. He'd written and rewritten it a dozen times, trying to find words adequate for feelings that seemed too large for language. A knock at his study door interrupted his brooding. Mrs. Chen entered with her usual quiet efficiency, but her expression carried an urgency that made Ellis look up from his papers. "Mr. Granger, you have visitors. The McKenna children are here, and they seem quite upset." Ellis rose immediately, his heart racing with possibilities, none of them good. He found Josie and Tom on his front porch, their faces flushed from running and their eyes bright, with the kind of distress that suggested serious trouble. "What's wrong?" Ellis asked, kneeling to their level. "Is your mother all right?" "Ma's fine," Josie said breathlessly. "But there are men at our house. From the bank. They're talking to her about debts and payments and saying terrible things." Ellis felt ice form in his stomach. "What kind of men? What are they saying?" "3 of them," Tom added, his voice shaking with indignation. "Mr. Henderson from the grain store and 2 others we didn't recognize. They said Ma owes money she can't pay, and they're going to take our house if she doesn't find $50 by tomorrow." "But that's impossible," Ellis said, his mind racing. "Your mother doesn't owe anything to the bank. I would know about any outstanding debts." "They said it was an old debt from when Pa was alive, something about tools he bought from the company store that weren't fully paid for when he died." Josie's hands were clenched into fists, her 12-year-old sense of justice outraged by the injustice. "They said since Ma inherited everything, she inherited the debts too." Ellis's anger was cold and precise, sharpened by years of banking experience and a growing understanding of what was really happening. Robert McKenna had been scrupulously honest about his debts, and Ellis would have known about any outstanding obligations. This was manipulation, pure and simply an attempt to pressure the family through manufactured crisis. "Listen to me carefully," Ellis said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Go back home and tell your mother that these men have no legal authority to make such demands. Tell her that I said any legitimate debts would have been settled through proper probate procedures 2 years ago." "But what if they don't listen?" Tom asked, his young voice trembling. "What if they try to take our house anyway?" Ellis stood, his jaw set with determination. "They won't. I'll make sure of it." But even as he reassured the children, Ellis understood the real message being sent. The bank board wasn't content to wait for Friday's meeting. They were applying pressure directly to the McKenna family, using intimidation and false legal claims to force Ellis into compliance. The tactic was despicable but effective. Ellis could weather professional consequences for his choices, but he couldn't stand by and watch Martha and her children threatened with homelessness because of their association with him. After sending the children home with promises that he would handle the situation, Ellis sat alone in his study and faced the hardest decision of his life. He could use his influence and legal knowledge to expose the board's tactics and protect the family. But doing so would mean declaring war on the very people who controlled his professional life, ensuring that his time in Dry Creek would end in scandal and bitter conflict. Or he could surrender, distance himself from the McKennas, let the town's gossips claim victory, and return to the isolated existence that had defined his life before he'd remembered how to love. The will on his desk represented a third option known that would require the ultimate sacrifice, but ensure the family's permanent security. If Ellis were to leave Dry Creek entirely, removing himself as a source of controversy, the McKennas would be free to rebuild their lives without the burden of community disapproval. And with the inheritance he'd arranged, they would never again face the desperate poverty that had brought them together. Ellis picked up his pen and added a codicil to the will, specifying that his bequests to the McKenna family should be delivered immediately upon his departure from Dry Creek, rather than waiting for his death. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would accomplish his primary goal, ensuring that Martha, Josie, and Tom were protected regardless of what happened to him. A second knock interrupted his thoughts. This time it was Martha herself, her face pale but determined, flanked by her children who looked relieved to see Ellis still at home. "I sent those men away," she announced without preamble. "Told them that any legitimate business could be conducted through proper legal channels during normal business hours." "Were they threatening?" Ellis asked, though the children's earlier distress had already answered that question. "They were unpleasant, but they weren't prepared for a widow who'd learned not to be intimidated by men who think they can frighten women into compliance." Martha's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I may not have your education, Ellis, but I've learned a few things about standing up to bullies." Ellis felt a surge of admiration for this woman who'd faced down 3 grown men attempting to intimidate her family. But he also understood that her courage would only make her a bigger target for people determined to use any means necessary to control his behavior. "Martha, we need to talk. All of us." Ellis looked at the 3 faces that had become more precious to him than anything he'd ever owned. "There are things you need to know about what's happening in town, and decisions we need to make together." As he led them into his study, where the will lay waiting like a bridge between his old life and whatever came next, Ellis realized that the approaching confrontation with the bank board was really just the beginning. The real battle would be fought not in boardrooms or legal offices, but in the hearts of 4 people who'd found each other against all odds and now had to decide whether their love was strong enough to survive the storm that others were determined to create. The leather saddle gleamed in the lamplight, its hand-tooled surface decorated with intricate patterns that spoke of countless hours of careful craftsmanship. Ellis had commissioned it weeks ago from the finest leather worker in the territory, intending it as a birthday gift for Tom. Now, as he ran his fingers over the smooth leather, it felt more like a farewell present, something beautiful to remember him by when he was gone. Tom stood beside him in the study, his 8-year-old eyes wide with wonder as he took in every detail of the saddle. The stirrups were sized perfectly for his small frame, and his initials T.M. were embossed in elegant script on the cantle. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Tom whispered, his voice filled with the kind of awe reserved for childhood's greatest treasures. "But why are you giving it to me now? Your birthday isn't until tomorrow." Ellis knelt beside the boy, his throat tight with emotions he was still learning to express. "Because I wanted to see you happy, and because there might not be time tomorrow." The cryptic answer made Tom frown with the confusion of a child trying to understand adult complexities. "What do you mean there might not be time?" Before Ellis could answer, Josie appeared in the doorway, her face set with the determination that had become familiar over their months together. Martha stood behind her, both of them having overheard enough of the conversation to understand that something significant was happening. "You're planning to leave, aren't you?" Josie's accusation cut through the warm atmosphere of gift-giving like a blade. "You're going to run away because people are talking about us." Ellis rose slowly, the weight of his decision pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. "It's more complicated than that, Josie." "No, it's not." Martha stepped into the room, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of making difficult decisions. "It's exactly that simple. You're letting fear drive you away from the people who love you." "I'm trying to protect you," Ellis protested, but even as he said the words, they sounded hollow to his own ears. "The bank board, the pressure from the community, my presence here is causing you problems I never intended." Tom's lower lip began to tremble as understanding dawned. "You don't want to be our family anymore?" The question hit Ellis like a physical blow. He knelt again, taking Tom's small hands in his larger ones, feeling the calluses that had formed from their whittling lessons together. "I will always want to be your family, Tom. Always. But sometimes adults have to make hard choices to keep the people they love safe." "That's the biggest load of nonsense I've ever heard," Martha said, her tone sharp enough to make everyone look at her in surprise. "Ellis Granger, you are the most intelligent man I know, but right now you're talking like a fool." Ellis stood, stung by her words but unable to deny their accuracy. "Martha, you don't understand the position I'm in. The bank board has made it clear that I have to choose between my career and your family. If I stay, they'll find ways to hurt all of you. And if you leave, you'll hurt us yourself," Josie said, her 12-year-old voice carrying wisdom beyond her years. "You'll break Tom's heart, disappoint Ma, and prove that all those people who think you're just a rich man playing with poor folks are right." The accusation stung because it contained more truth than Ellis wanted to acknowledge. Was he really protecting them, or was he simply choosing the easier path, the one that would let him return to his comfortable isolation without having to fight for what mattered? "I've arranged for your financial security," Ellis said, gesturing toward the papers on his desk. "The will provides for everything you could need, the house, the ranch, enough money to ensure you never face poverty again." "We don't want your money," Martha said firmly. "We want you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, powerful in its directness. Ellis had spent his entire adult life believing that money could solve any problem, that financial security was the greatest gift he could offer. But looking at these three faces, Tom's confusion, Josie's hurt, Martha's disappointment, realized how completely he'd misunderstood what they needed from him. "The saddle was supposed to represent hope," Ellis said quietly, his eyes fixed on Tom's gift. "I wanted you to have something that would remind you of all the rides we could take together, all the adventures we could share." "Then why does it feel like goodbye?" Tom asked, his young voice breaking Ellis's heart with its honesty. Ellis looked around the study that had become a gathering place for this unlikely family at, the books Josie had organized, the corner where Tom practiced his whittling, the chair where Martha had sat and shared stories of her husband. This room, like his life, had been transformed by their presence from a place of solitary work into something warm and meaningful. The sound of approaching hoofbeats outside interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, Ellis could see 3 riders approaching the house, their purposeful pace suggesting official business. The bank board had apparently decided not to wait for tomorrow's meeting. "Stay here," Ellis told the family, his voice suddenly steady with resolve. "Whatever happens, stay inside until they're gone." But as he moved toward the door, Tom's voice stopped him. "Mr. Granger, are you going to fight for us, or are you going to let them win?" Ellis looked back at the boy who'd become like a son to him, at the saddle that represented so many unfulfilled promises, at the family that had taught him the difference between existing and living. For the first time since Sheriff Wade's warning, Ellis felt his uncertainty crystallize into clarity. The men outside represented everything he'd once valued: social position, financial stability, the respect of his peers. But the people in this room represented something far more precious: love, loyalty, and the kind of happiness he'd thought was lost to him forever. "I'm going to fight," Ellis said, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. "And I'm going to win." The McKenna family land deed lay spread across the conference table like a declaration of war, its official seals and legal language transforming mere paper into something approaching sacred text. Ellis had worked through the night with his lawyer, ensuring every detail was perfect, every clause unassailable. This document would guarantee the family's security, regardless of what happened to him in the coming confrontation. The bank board members sat across from Ellis in the formal meeting room, their faces grave with the weight of their position. These were men he'd worked with for years, men who'd respected his judgment and relied on his expertise. Now they looked at him like a stranger, whose behavior had become incomprehensible. "Ellis," said Harrison Wade, the bank's senior board member and brother to Sheriff Wade, "we've known each other for 15 years. I've never questioned your judgment or your character, but this situation with the McKenna family has raised concerns that we can no longer ignore." Ellis remained silent, his hands folded calmly on the table. The legal documents were arranged before him like chess pieces, each one serving a specific purpose in the strategy he'd developed during his sleepless night of preparation. "The community's confidence in this institution depends on its leadership maintaining the highest standards of conduct," continued board member Samuel Chen, Mrs. Chen's husband and the town's most successful merchant. "Your relationship with Mrs. McKenna has created an appearance of impropriety that threatens our reputation." "What impropriety?" Ellis asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Helping a family in crisis? Ensuring that children don't lose their mother to poverty? Honoring the memory of a good man who died too young?" "You know it's not that simple," Harrison replied. "A wealthy bachelor spending so much time with a widow, providing financial support, becoming involved in her children's daily lives, people draw conclusions." Ellis leaned forward slightly, his banker's instincts taking over as he prepared to negotiate the most important deal of his life. "Let me make sure I understand your position. You believe that my assistance to the McKenna family, assistance that has harmed no one and helped people in desperate need, should cease because it might cause gossip among people with nothing better to do than speculate about others' motives. We believe your judgment has been compromised by emotional attachment," said the third board member, a man named Peterson who owned the largest general store in town. "Your behavior has become increasingly erratic, prioritizing personal relationships over professional responsibilities." Ellis reached for the first document in his carefully arranged stack. "Gentlemen, I've prepared something that I believe will address all of your concerns." The deed to the McKenna property was comprehensive, legally transferring ownership of their small farm from Martha McKenna to a trust that would ensure the land could never be taken from the family for debt or any other reason. Ellis had quietly purchased the property from the original mortgage holder, then restructured it to provide permanent security. This document establishes the McKenna family's absolute ownership of their land, free and clear of any encumbrances. It also establishes a trust fund, sufficient to ensure their ongoing financial security without requiring any further assistance from me or anyone else. The board members examined the papers with the careful attention of men who understood the weight of legal documents. Harrison looked up first, his expression puzzled. "Ellis, this is extraordinarily generous, but it doesn't address our primary concern. If anything, it reinforces the appearance that your relationship with this family goes beyond appropriate boundaries." Ellis had anticipated this response. He reached for the second documentee's resignation letter from the bank presidency. "Perhaps this will clarify my priorities," he said, sliding the letter across the table. "Effective immediately, I resign my position as president of Dry Creek First National Bank. I also divest myself of all stock holdings in the institution, transferring my shares to the remaining board members at fair market value." The silence that followed was absolute. These men had expected to pressure Ellis into distancing himself from the McKenna family, not to receive his complete withdrawal from the business they'd all built together. "You can't be serious," Samuel Chen said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ellis, this bank is your life's work. You've spent 20 years building it into the most respected financial institution in 3 counties. I've spent 20 years building something that I thought mattered, Ellis corrected. But I've learned recently that there are things more important than institutional respect or financial success. Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Ellis with the expression of a man trying to solve a complicated puzzle. What do you intend to do? How will you support yourself without your position here? Ellis smiled for the first time since entering the room. The cattle ranch provides sufficient income for my needs. And I have a family now, people who care more about the man I'm becoming than the position I've held. The McKenna family, Peterson said, understanding dawning in his voice. My family, Ellis corrected firmly. By choice, by love, and soon, I hope, by law. I intend to ask Martha McKenna to marry me and to formally adopt Josie and Tom as my children. The declaration hit the room like a thunderbolt. These men had expected contrition, compromise, perhaps a strategic retreat. Instead, they were witnessing Ellis Granger's complete transformation from the isolated banker they'd known into someone entirely different, someone willing to sacrifice everything for love. Have you lost your mind? Harrison asked, his voice rising with incredulity. You're throwing away everything you've worked for, everything you've achieved, for a woman and 2 children you've known for a few months. Ellis gathered his papers with the calm efficiency of a man who'd made peace with his choices. No, Harrison, I'm finally gaining everything that matters. The McKenna family taught me the difference between success and significance, between having wealth and being rich. He stood, adjusting his jacket with the same dignity he'd maintained throughout his banking career. Gentlemen, thank you for your years of partnership. I trust you'll find a capable replacement who shares your vision for the institution's future. As Ellis walked toward the door, Harrison called after him. Ellis, if you change your mind. I won't, Ellis replied without turning around. Some decisions, once made, define who you really are. This is mine. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed through the silent room, leaving 3 men to contemplate the wreckage of their carefully planned intervention, and Ellis Granger walking toward a future that held no guarantees except the promise of love freely given and gratefully received. 6 months after Ellis Granger walked away from the bank that had defined his life for 2 decades, the McKenna farm bustled with the kind of prosperity that came not from wealth, but from purpose. The expanded property stretched across green pastures, where Clover grazed contentedly alongside a small herd of cattle, her grey coat gleaming in the spring sunshine that seemed to bless everything it touched. Martha stood in the doorway of their enlarged farmhouse, watching her husband, for Ellis had indeed proposed, and she had indeed accepted teach Tom the finer points of cattle management. The boy had grown inches over the winter, his confidence blooming under Ellis's patient guidance and unconditional love. He wore the leather chaps Ellis had made for him, and his movements around the animals showed the easy competence of someone who'd found his calling. Pa says I can help with the spring branding next week, Tom announced proudly as he approached the house, using the title that had come naturally to him within weeks of the wedding. He says I'm getting good enough with the rope to be useful instead of just decorative. Martha laughed, the sound carrying the joy that had become her default expression since their lives had stabilized into something resembling happiness. Did he actually say decorative? He said I was developing practical skills to match my enthusiasm, Tom corrected with a grin. But I like decorative better. It sounds fancier. Josie emerged from the house carrying her schoolbooks, her face bright with the intellectual stimulation that came from finally having access to proper education. Ellis had arranged for a tutor from Denver to visit twice weekly, supplementing the local schoolhouse's limited offerings with advanced mathematics, literature, and science. At 13, she was already reading at a level that would prepare her for college if she chose that path. Mrs. Patterson asked me to help teach the younger children their letters, Josie announced. She says I have a gift for explaining things in ways they can understand. Just like your mother, Ellis said, approaching the group with the easy stride of a man who'd found his place in the world. Martha always could make the most complicated scripture seem simple and meaningful. The transformation in Ellis was remarkable to anyone who'd known him before. Gone was the formal stiffness that had characterized his interactions for so many years. In its place was a warmth that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside, as if the act of loving and being loved had restored some essential part of himself he'd thought was permanently lost. The town's reaction to their marriage had been mixed, but generally positive. Many people had been moved by the obvious happiness of the family, and Ellis's generous donations to the church and school had gone a long way towards smoothing any remaining social friction. His replacement at the bank, a competent man from Colorado Springs, had maintained the institution's stability, while Ellis focused on his new life as a rancher and father. The photographer should be here soon. Martha reminded them, smoothing her best dress and checking her reflection in the front window. Mrs. Chen said he's one of the finest portrait artists in the territory. The idea for a family portrait had been Tom's, inspired by the old photograph of Ellis and his father that had revealed so much about their intertwined histories. "We need a picture to show that we're a real family now," he'd argued with 8-year-old logic, "something to put on the mantel so everyone knows we belong together." Ellis had commissioned the photographer immediately, understanding the deeper meaning behind Tom's request. This portrait would represent not just their current happiness, but their commitment to a shared futura, visual declaration that they had chosen each other, despite all the obstacles that had tried to keep them apart. When the photographer arrived with his elaborate equipment and chemical preparations, the family gathered on the front porch that Ellis had expanded to accommodate their growing needs. The positioning required several attempts. Tom kept fidgeting with excitement, and Josie worried about whether her dress looked proper, but eventually they settled into an arrangement that felt natural. Ellis sat in the center with Martha beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm in a gesture that spoke of partnership and trust. Tom stood at Ellis's right shoulder, one hand on his adoptive father's chair, while Josie positioned herself beside her mother, her posture reflecting the dignity she'd learned to carry as the family's eldest child. "Hold very still," the photographer instructed, preparing his equipment with the methodical care of a craftsman. "This image will last for generations, so we want it to be perfect." As they waited for the exposure to complete, Ellis found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The desperate morning when 2 children had tried to sell their horse seemed like something from another lifetime, though it had been less than a year ago. The man who had watched from the bank porch, isolated by his own pride and grief, felt like a stranger whose choices he could barely comprehend. Martha's wedding ring quilt now covered their bed, finally completed with the help of several church ladies who'd organized quilting circles at the farmhouse. The pattern of interlocking rings had taken on new meaning, no longer a symbol of interrupted dreams, but a representation of how separate lives could be woven together into something stronger and more beautiful than any individual thread. "All finished," the photographer announced, beginning to pack his equipment. "You should have the finished portraits within 2 weeks." That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table Ellis had built to accommodate their expanded household, Tom raised a question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Pa, do you ever miss the bank? Do you ever wish you'd made different choices?" Ellis looked around the table at the faces that had become his world, Martha's gentle wisdom, Josie's growing confidence, Tom's irrepressible joy. Outside, Clover whinnied softly in her pasture, calling to her human family as she did every evening. The sound had become as familiar and comforting as a lullaby. "No, son," Ellis said, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who'd finally learned the difference between what the world valued and what actually mattered. "I've never been richer than I am right now." As the sun set over their thriving farm, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the Granger family, for that was their name now, legally and lovingly settled into another evening of the simple happiness that had proved to be life's greatest treasure. The photograph would capture their faces, but the love that bound them together would endure long after the image faded, passed down through generations as proof that sometimes the most unlikely families are the ones that choose each other against all odds. In the distance, the lights of Dry Creek flickered to life, marking another day's end, in a town where everyone now knew the story of the rich cowboy who'd found his fortune not in gold or cattle or bank shares, but in the laughter of children and the love of a woman who taught him that the heart's true wealth could never be counted, only felt.